And just as Lenin and the Bolsheviks and the Chekists took joy in slaughtering Christians and slaughtering priests by the tens of thousands, Sam Harris has joy when he sees religious people being butchered in Gaza.
Yeah, I'm sure there have been missteps by the IDF. I mean, we know there have been. I mean, there have been some recently. It's a very difficult thing to respond to, and it's very hard for me to criticize anything that has been done.
Sam Harris is someone who stems from the school of that old atheism from the 20th century. That old atheism that you see that is really of the same spirit of the Trotskys and the Lenins and the Rosa Luxemburgs and the Karl Radeks. That spirit that also possessed the Bela Kuns, the Chekas. That spirit goes back to ancient Judea. Go back to the time of Christ. Who was Christ battling against? He was battling against the Sadducees. They were really quite adjacent to atheist. And their religion was, you could say, a form of proto-atheism. And they were really the fathers of that very spirit that would possess Lenin and Trotsky and Bela Kun and Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Radek and those like them. How could you be so cruel? It's because the Sadducees had no brakes. Just like Lenin had no brakes, just like Sam Harris has no brakes. Just like the people like them, their ilk, have no brakes, no limits, no nothing. And many people responded to the Bolshevik terror by subscribing to Nazi ideology or some other ethnocentric, ultra-nationalistic ideology. And they turned to mass murder. And what do we see today? What we see today is many young people watching with horror what Israel did to Gaza and what Israel continues to do to Gaza and to the Palestinians. And many people are making the same mistake as what many young people did in the mid-20th century. And that is, they are treading upon the road of Hitlerism. We are going to return right back to the very evils of the past. This is the lesson of history that we are ignoring. And it's like what the professor J. Rufus Fears said. He said that the biggest lesson of history is that we do not learn from history. All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about the similarities between Nazism and Bolshevism. In Nazism and Bolshevism, the state is God. In Nazism, the state is God, and the religion is the race, the Germanic race, the Aryan race. And in Bolshevism, the state is also God, and the religion is the proletariat. Both of these systems are absent of any moral standards. There is no morality in Nazism nor in Bolshevism, because in both of these systems, we are supposed to follow the dictates and the whims of men. In Nazism, we are to follow the whims of the Führer, and in Bolshevism, we are to follow the whims and the dictates of the communist leadership. And if the Nazis or the communists tell their followers to slaughter tens of millions of people, those orders are to be followed with the utmost of obedience, because the state is God. And when human beings are the source of your morality, you have no moral standard, because it is absolutely impossible to get a moral standard from human beings. Now, the atheists like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris will come along and they will say, no, 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 humanity is our source of morality. If humanity is the source for your morality, then your entire moral system falls apart, because you would be following the whims of human beings. You can have one group of people come along and say that mass murder is wrong, but you can have an entirely different group of people come along and say that genocide is absolutely obligatory for us to do. And who are you to say that we cannot follow the latter of the two? Because the mass murderers, the people who are pro-genocide, are also members of humanity, and if humanity is the source for our morality, why can't we follow the members of humanity who believe that genocide is totally righteous? So the entire system falls apart. And in Nazism and in Bolshevism, moral decision-making is determined by human beings, and therefore there are no moral standards in neither Bolshevism nor in Nazism. And that is why the followers of both of these moral systems butchered tens of millions of people. That is why the Bolsheviks had no moral qualms with starving tens of millions of people, slaughtering tens of millions of people. Now, for the Marxist, the religion is the proletariat. The state is God. As with the Nazis, the state is God. But the religion is the proletariat. You know, the worker, the laborer, the factory worker. We are to honor those people. And in order to honor those people, we cannot own any property. It is wrong for any individual to own property. Well, who owns the property? Well, the state owns the property. So the Bolsheviks came along and they basically said private ownership is bad. Private ownership is evil and should be abolished. And so if I had to sum up Marxism into one line, it would be that. It would be private ownership is bad. That is Marxism. Now, Marxists will come along and they will try to sell you their ideology with all sorts of word salads and verbal masturbation and flowery language, and they will write countless books on Marxism. What is Marxism? And they'll use these massive clusters of huge words and flowery language and sophistical sentences, and they will try to sound oh so sophisticated. And really all what they're saying is private ownership is bad, individual private ownership is bad, and the state should own everything. And I have never seen people who have mastered the art of selling people dog shit under the facade of flowery language like the Marxists. The Marxists have absolutely and utterly mastered the strategy of selling people bullshit under the mask of flowery language. They will sit there and use this. They will sit there and use all of these massive word salads. Well, we must pursue the self-actualization of the collective into the phenomenology of spirit, which descends from the Hegelian dialectic, which leads us into the realization of what it is to be a member of the proletariat under the dictates of the tyrannical landowners and the landlords.
The one signifier which introduces order or whatever tries to organize the field of knowledge, it fails, and this you should also remember. This is for Lacan also this confrontation or like a coupling of the subject with object, in the sense of object cause of desire, is for Lacan also the formula of fantasy.
The accumulation of empirical things and something else which comes down and forms them. And so then he tries to reconstrue Marxism as a kind of science. And then he asks, where is the coupure epistemologique? Where does Marx actually and then you could say, and the analog to the notion of gravitation, for example, is surplus value, right? Surplus value is not an empirical concept. It's a theoretical concept.
The basic existentialist concept is rescued through the consciousness which declares war on this reality, in the knowledge that reality will remain the victor. This idea of the productivity of discourse in constituting subjectivities has become the general figure of social analysis since then. From this point of view, Freud, instead of being the great liberator, became the producer of discourses that constituted constrained subjectivities. Marx was treated more carefully, mentioned only once in Foucault's text, to show that the bourgeoisie took a long time to acknowledge the bodies and sex of the proletariat.
I argue in the book that the individual cannot be found sort of in itself on its own, as it were, but that every perception of any individual, and there's a kind of analysis of perception behind this, you can see an individual as an individual insofar as it stands out from a background into some indefinite horizon. If you work with these terms, which I try to do, that through an individual being seen in relation to a background and horizon, you get a kind of incipient ecological conception of perception. And that is where one, that's where one could find individuals in a way that isn't subject to the post-structuralist critique. I pretty much center my reading of Marx on the first volume of Capital. And my argument about his eliding the fecundity of nature begins from suggesting that he actually elides the fecundity of labor.
All this flowery language that they give you, instead of just saying, we believe that individual private ownership is bad. That's what Marxism teaches. And that is the reason why Marxists hate landlords. That's the reason why, because, well, they want to be the landlords. They're against private ownership because they want to own everything. And so they'll tell you landlords are evil, CEOs are evil, business owners are evil. Why are they evil? Well, because they have employees, or they have people who pay them money for services, or they own property and they'll rent that property out and they'll get money, they'll get extra income, God forbid, by renting that property out. So that makes them evil. Okay, so what's your solution? How do you want to solve this issue that you have? How do you wish to solve this issue that's really bothering you so much? People are owning property, and they'll say, well, the state should own everything. Oh, I see. So you want to establish this Bolshevik, Marxist, communist takeover and own everything. So you want to be the landlord. So you want to take all the houses. So you're worse than the landlords that you claim to hate. You hate the guy for being a landlord because he is renting 1 or 2 houses to make some extra income, but you want to own all of the houses. You want to control the state, and you want to own all of the property. So you want to be the biggest landlord in the world. You want to be the owner of all of the businesses, of all of the companies. So you want to be the biggest CEO in the world. So you want to be something worse than what you claim to be against. And so really, at the end of the day, Bolshevism, Marxism is just legalized theft. That's all it is. It's legalized theft that is sold to people under flowery language, sophistry, and verbal masturbation. That's all it is. And what does it lead to? Well, we can just look at the history. Let's look at the history of Bolshevism, shall we? When the Bolsheviks took over Russia, really with the backing of the German government, because the German government sent this guy named Vladimir Lenin to Russia, and they gave him an ungodly amount of gold to finance his Bolshevik revolution. The Bolshevik revolution was a success. The Bolsheviks took over, and what did the Bolsheviks begin to do? They began to say, well, we have our enemy within, the enemy of the proletariat, the enemy of the working class is the kulak. Now, what is a kulak? The kulaks were peasants. They were a little bit better off than the general peasant population. What made you a kulak? What made you a kulak was, God forbid, you owned 3 to 5 cows, and or you owned some land and you hired some labor. That was your crime. That was your unforgivable crime. And for that, for owning some cows, for hiring some labor, for owning some land, you deserved death. Now, the kulaks only made up between 3 and 5% of the peasant population, if I remember correctly. But a huge portion of the food that was being produced within the Russian Empire was produced from the land that was owned by the kulaks. So the kulaks were the best farmers. They were the most knowledgeable when it came to agriculture. But what did the Bolsheviks decide to do? They decided to do a genocide of the kulaks. And so they commenced what is known as dekulakization, or the genocide of the kulaks. And they slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people. Hundreds of thousands of people. And then what happened? Well, what happened was the Russian Empire was left with a bunch of peasants who didn't know what the hell they were doing, because the Bolshevik government butchered the kulaks, and the kulaks were the ones who had the most agricultural knowledge. That is why, even though the kulaks only made up between 3 and 5% of the peasant population, they produced a huge, substantial portion of the food for the Russian Empire. So then what happened? Starvation. Starvation happened, and millions upon millions of people starved to death. And the poor peasants who were left, they were left to do the rest of the farm work. They didn't have the kulaks to help them. And here were these peasants laboring away, growing the wheat, growing the corn, and whatever harvest they had, whatever harvest they were able to produce, the Bolshevik government came along and said, this food doesn't belong to you. You peasants don't deserve this food. This food belongs to the factory worker. That's the proletariat. You guys don't deserve this food. And the Bolshevik state confiscated the corn, they confiscated the wheat, and they brought it all to the city centers, to the urban zones of the Russian Empire. And those peasants were left to starve. And you had peasants who were initially avowed supporters of the Bolshevik Revolution. You had peasants who were firm believers in the Leninist cause, and now they were left alone, abandoned by their Bolshevik heroes, and they were starving to death. And they did starve to death, and millions of people starved to death. Now, here were the Bolsheviks claiming that they were for the worker, the laborer, and who suffered the most? The laborer, the peasant. They claimed that they were for the poor, and who suffered the most? The peasant. The poorest of the poor suffered the most. They starved by the millions. And if some poor peasant decided to hide some potatoes for himself so that he wouldn't starve to death because he knew that winter was nigh, he knew that winter was coming, the goons of the Bolshevik state would come along and say, you're hoarding potatoes, you're hoarding food, you are hoarding food which could be given to the factory workers, to those poor members of the proletariat. Don't you care about the factory workers? You are selfish, you are cruel, you are absent of compassion. And they would take those potatoes away. And if the peasant dared to resist the goon squad of the Bolshevik state, they would murder that peasant. And so these Bolsheviks were mass murdering people. And after they slaughtered all of the kulaks, the Bolsheviks, well, their bloodthirstiness, their sanguinary desires were not satiated. They were not satisfied, and they desired to kill more people. So who were their next victims? They said, well, we've slaughtered all the kulaks. Who else can we kill? Well, you killed all the kulaks who were really the most wealthy of the peasants, but you have this other set of peasants, this other group of peasants who are also a little bit above everyone else. So they're not as wealthy as the kulaks were, but they're adjacent to the kulaks. So let's start killing those people. And they started butchering those people, the kulak adjacent people. And they just kept killing and killing and killing, and there were no breaks. There were no limits. Why were there no limits? Why was there no one there to put the foot on the brakes on the mass murder machine of the Bolsheviks? Because there was no God in their belief system. There was no moral standard, no moral principles, no moral foundation, because the state was God in the religion of the Bolshevik, and that meant that the leaders of the Bolshevik state were God. And the state, like every other government in history, consisted entirely of human beings, and so their decision-making, what determined what was wrong and what was right, was utterly dictated by the whims of men. And when your moral system comes solely from mankind, you have no moral standard and you have no breaks. And that is why the Bolsheviks did not stop with the killing. They just kept killing and killing and killing. And many of these Bolsheviks just so happened to be Jewish. And they had this concept of, well, yes, we are Jews, but we are also atheists. And because we are atheists, we believe in evolutionism, in Darwinism. And what is the law of the land in the social Darwinian worldview? The law of the land is survival of the fittest, and therefore power is one's only goal. There is no judicial system that says, hey, we have to follow a set of rules that are etched in stone. And so there are no limits. And that is the reason why. And that is the reason why the code of the Bolshevik was, according to the Latvian Bolshevik Martin Latsis, that if a man is arrested, I need not know what crime he has done. I don't even have to prove if he has committed a crime. All I need to know is what class is he a member of. And once I find out that he is a member of a class that I despise, then I sentence him to death. So this man is a member of the kulak class. He is deserving of death, and that is that. And so they hoarded all the food to the city centers. They hold all the food to the city centers, and the peasants were left to starve to death. And really, is it not ironic that the Bolsheviks marketed themselves as the people for the poor, as the defenders of the working class, the defenders of the laborers, and who were their biggest victims? The peasants, the poor. And it reminds me of the French Revolution, which really was the father of the Bolshevik Revolution. You know, Muammar Gaddafi wrote a book. I forgot the name of the book, but I read it years ago. Muammar Gaddafi, they tried to portray him as a madman. Muammar Gaddafi was a very educated man. He read a lot of books. He enjoyed reading history. And Muammar Gaddafi wrote that the Bolshevik Revolution was birthed by the French Revolution. The French Revolution inspired the Bolshevik Revolution. This is a fact. And the French revolutionaries marketed themselves, they presented themselves as the defenders of the poor, of the workers, of the average man, and that they were simply enemies of the rich, enemies of the monarchy, enemies of the church, and they were simply the defenders of the little guy. And once the revolutionaries commenced their reign of terror, who were their biggest victims? Their biggest victims were the poor, the peasants. And the same thing went for the Bolsheviks. Their biggest victims were the peasant class. They had no limits. And if you look at the atheists today, Sam Harris, he's very similar to the atheist of old, the atheist of the mid-20th century. Very similar to the Lenins and the Trotskys. Very similar to the Bela Kuns, the mass murderers of the Bolshevik state. Look at Sam Harris's views of the slaughterhouse in Gaza. Look at Sam Harris's views on what Israel did to Gaza.
It's amazing what has happened. Again, on social media with the gaming of public opinion against Israel based on, no doubt, a terrible death toll in Gaza, but based on, in many cases, fictional figures coming from Hamas. Yeah, I'm sure there have been missteps by the IDF. I mean, we know there have been. I mean, there have been some recently acknowledged. I do believe that the IDF has done a better job of sparing innocent life than my own government would have or has in any of its conflicts against jihadists. It's very hard to see that any army would have done a better job of this. It's a very difficult thing to respond to, and it's very hard for me to criticize anything that has been done.
Sam Harris is someone who stems from the school of that old atheism from the 20th century. That old atheism that you see that is really of the same spirit of the Trotskys and the Lenins and the Rosa Luxemburgs and the Karl Radeks. That spirit that also possessed the Bela Kuns, the Chekas. Sam Harris has no limits. He doesn't put the foot on the brakes. He doesn't give a damn. Why? Because in Gaza, it's religious people who are butchered. That's the reason why. Muslims are being butchered. Muslims worship one God. Muslims are close to Christianity. Yes, they are a Christian heresy, but they still have Christian influence. They still honor the Virgin Mary. They still honor Jesus Christ and say Christ is the Messiah. They have a distorted view of God, and they have a mistaken view of Jesus Christ, but they still will respect Jesus Christ as a prophet at least. And Sam Harris sees that, and just as Lenin and the Bolsheviks and the Chekists took joy in slaughtering Christians and slaughtering priests by the tens of thousands, Sam Harris has joy when he sees religious people being butchered in Gaza. That's the reason why it's that spirit that I'm talking about. And that spirit is very, very ancient. Very ancient. That spirit goes back to ancient Judea. Go back to the time of Christ. Who was Christ battling against? Who was Christ battling against? He was battling against the Sadducees. Who were the Sadducees? The Sadducees were a sect of ancient Judaism that controlled the temple. They were the priests. They controlled the priests, the priesthood, or the priestly order, the Levitical priestly order, in the temple, in the second temple. And the Sadducees, even though they were the priests, they were really quite adjacent to atheists. And their religion was, you could say, a form of proto-atheism, because the Sadducees taught that there were no angels. The Sadducees said that the only books of the Bible that were legitimate were the first 5 books. The Sadducees rejected the afterlife. They said there was no afterlife. So if there is no afterlife, then what is the point of following your priesthood? What is the point of following your religion? There is no afterlife. And so the Sadducees were really a group of elitists who did not care about God, who effectively lived as atheists because they lived as if God did not exist, because to them there was no afterlife, there was no concept of eternal punishment, nor eternal reward. And so therefore there was no reason to follow their religion, and they had no reason to follow their own moral standard either, because what is the point of following a moral standard if there is no afterlife, if when we die there is nothing? And so this was the sect of the Sadducees. Sure, they claimed to have believed in God, but they lived as if there was no God, and they spoke as if there was no God. In fact, Josephus tells us that out of all of the Jewish sects, there was no sect as vicious as the Sadducees. There was no sect as cruel and as brutal as the Sadducees. And Josephus says this in light of, and really in the context of, the Sadducees murdering St. James, in which they took James and threw him off a roof and then finished him off by slamming a rock onto his body and killing him. That was the Sadducees. And it was the Sadducees that were directly responsible for the murder of Jesus Christ. They were directly responsible for the murder of Jesus Christ. If you read the New Testament, the main conspirators are the high priest Annas and Caiaphas, who were both members of the Sadducees, And the Sadducees were so godless that when Jesus Christ went to Lazarus' tomb and said, "Lazarus, awaken from the tomb," and Lazarus awoke from the dead. Lazarus was revived from the dead and he exited his tomb. The Bible tells us that the Sadducees said, "Let us murder Lazarus and Christ." They wanted to murder Lazarus after he was revived from the dead. You cannot be more godless than that. You cannot be more evil than that. That is the epitome of evil. You just saw a miracle. A man was rescued from death. And the Sadducees are saying, let's murder him. Let's put that man back in the grave. And not only that, let's murder the man who saved this man from death. Let's murder Jesus who rescued this man from the grave. Sure, they said they believed in God, but they lived as if there was no God. They were the proto-atheists. They were the original atheists, so to speak. And they were really the fathers of that very spirit that would possess Lenin and Trotsky and Bela Kun and Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Radek and those like them. They were atheistic. And Christ combated their atheism. How do I know this? Read the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. What happens? This is the parable that is proclaimed and articulated by Christ. Christ gives us the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. He says there was a poor man named Lazarus who was suffering. He was outside of the rich man's home, and his body was covered with wounds, and the dogs would come and lick his wounds, and Lazarus was dying, and Lazarus begged, and he said, if only I could just eat the scraps from the rich man's table. And the rich man didn't give a damn about this poor man named Lazarus who was lying there dying. And eventually Lazarus died, and shortly after Lazarus's death, the rich man also died. And the rich man woke up, and he found himself in hell. and he looked up and he could see Abraham. Abraham was in paradise with Lazarus. And the rich man says, Abraham, could you please go back to earth and tell my 5 brothers about this place so that they may repent and they may know about this place? And Abraham said no. Because even if a man were brought back from the dead, they would still not believe. And that is exactly what the Sadducees did. That is exactly what Caiaphas and Annas did. And it's amazing. Who is the rich man in this analogy? Who is the rich man in this parable? Well, we all know who Lazarus is. Lazarus in this parable is representing Lazarus, the poor man who Christ revived from the tomb. But who is the rich man? The rich man is Caiaphas. Because the rich man says, Abraham, could you please go to my 5 brothers and tell them about this place? Caiaphas had 5 brothers-in-law, and in that time in history in Judea, there was no concept of brothers-in-law. Your brothers-in-law were just your brothers. Caiaphas had 5 brothers. Caiaphas was the son-in-law of the high priest Annas. He married the daughter of Annas, and therefore he had 5 brothers-in-law. So the rich man says, the rich man says, Abraham, go to my 5 brothers, my 5 brothers-in-law, specifically, so that they may know about this place. Tell them that hell exists. And Abraham says, no, for even if a man, Lazarus, was brought back from the dead, they would still not believe. Believe in what? The existence of hell. Because the Sadducees did not believe in the existence of the afterlife. Caiaphas and Annas did not believe in the existence of the afterlife, and therefore they lived their lives as if God did not exist. That is why they sought the death of Lazarus even after he was rescued from the grave, and that is why they sought the murder of Christ, even though he was the Messiah of the Jews, even though he rescued Lazarus from the grave. And just as Lenin watched those poor peasants starving to death and did not give a damn, the rich man watched as poor Lazarus was dying and starving to death, and he did not give a damn. He was possessed by that same spirit that possessed the Leninists and the Bolsheviks. And so that spirit, that atheistic spirit, was alive and well in ancient Judea, and it germinated in Judea. That seed germinated and it grew, and its roots spread into Europe. Its roots spread into Eastern Europe. It spread into the souls of certain people in Russia, in Ukraine, in Poland, in other parts of Eastern Europe. And that same murderousness that has no limits and no breaks was there. It was alive and well. And those Sadducees, those high priests, Caiaphas and Annas, they saw Jesus Christ bringing Lazarus back from the dead, and they did not care. They sought the death of Lazarus. They wanted to murder Lazarus, and they wanted to murder the man who rescued Lazarus from the dead, who revived Lazarus from the dead. How could you be so evil? How could you be so cruel? It's because the Sadducees had no brakes. Just like Lenin had no brakes, just like Sam Harris has no brakes, just like the people like them, their ilk, have no brakes, no limits, no nothing. They have no brakes because they live their lives as if God doesn't exist. They don't believe that morals and moral standards springs from God. They don't believe that morality springs from something eternal, something that is above humanity. They believe that morals spring from human beings. And because they believe that morality springs from humanity, they have no moral standards because they are dictated by the ebb and flow of the whims and the capriciousness of man. They are dictated by the ebb and flow of the unsturdy waves that live within their unsteady souls, their unsettled souls. And so they have no brakes. There's no moral standard, nothing. And the world watched as the Bolsheviks butchered and slaughtered and starved people by the tens of millions. And what happened? People began to say, well, a lot of those Bolsheviks just so happened to be Jewish. Vladimir Lenin was Jewish, Bella Kuhn was Jewish, Rosa Luxemburg was Jewish, Karl Radek was Jewish, Trotsky was Jewish, much of the Cheka was Jewish. In fact, the Yale professor, the Yale historian Timothy Snyder, writes that 40% of the major Bolshevik leadership, or the major Cheka leadership, the Cheka were the enforcers of Bolshevik law, 40% of the major leadership within the Cheka of the Bolshevik state were Jewish. And I'm not saying this because I want to promote some anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. I'm simply making an objective observation of history. And so what happened? Well, the historian Hilaire Belloc was observing this phenomenon, and he wrote a book about it. This is the book. And if you have not read this book, I highly recommend that you do. And Hilaire Belloc wrote this book as a warning. And the warning was that much of the Western world was watching the horror, the mass murder that was being orchestrated by the Bolsheviks. And they were saying, you know, the Jews are a problem. And Hilaire Belloc wasn't saying that these people were morally correct, but Hilaire Belloc was warning the world about the revival of anti-Semitism. And what he was observing was that fanatics, Nazis, anti-Semites were using the reality of Bolshevism. They were pointing to the horrors that were done by the Bolsheviks in order to justify anti-Semitic militancy, hence the rise of the Nazis. And the Nazis pointed to the violence of the Bolsheviks as a pretext to justify mass murder. And this is really what Hilaire Belloc was warning about. And what happened? The Nazis rose up, and the Nazis went to the Ukrainians. They went to the Ukrainian nationalists. They went to the members of the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and they went to the UPA, which was another Ukrainian nationalist militant organization. And they armed those people, and they trained those people, and they made an alliance with the Ukrainian nationalists. They made an alliance with people like Stepan Bandera and Andrei Melnik and Shukhevich. And they used these Ukrainian militants as proxies. And the Nazis eventually took over half of Poland. The Soviet Union took over the other half of Poland. And eventually the Nazis turned on the Soviets. And the Nazis pushed the Soviets out of Poland, and they pushed the Soviets out of Ukraine. And the Nazis went to those very Ukrainian nationalists who they were backing. And the Nazis told the Ukrainian nationalist, we give you the green light to butcher and slaughter the Jews. And the Nazis and their Ukrainian allies together butchered countless people. They would do a single massacre and slaughter 10,000 people just like that. In a single night! In a single night! The Ukrainian nationalists would slaughter 10,000 people. In a single massacre, they would slaughter tens of thousands of people. And the Nazis would slaughter millions of people in Eastern Europe. And the Nazis, like the Bolsheviks, had no limits. And the Nazis marketed themselves as the defender of Europe, and they marketed themselves as the ones who were going to save Europe from the Bolshevik terror, that they were going to save Europeans from the Red Terror and the Bolshevik mass murderers. And what happened? They themselves were murderers. They themselves became what they claimed to be against. They themselves became what they claimed they were defending people from. They said, we're going to fight against the Bolshevik monsters, and they became the monsters. They became the mass murderers. They themselves had no limits. And why did the Nazis have no limits? Because they had no moral standard, because they had no God. Their God was the state, and the state was dictated by the Führer, and therefore all of their decision-making was dictated by the whims of men. And they had no limits. And they worshipped race. Race was their religion. And they became exactly what they claimed to have hated. And what do we see today? What we see today is, well, something similar to what happened in the past. As Hilaire Belloc recounts in his history, many men, and he specifies men, not women, he says that many men in the Western world watched with horror the atrocities that were being done by the Bolsheviks. And many men began to subscribe to anti-Semitic beliefs. And this is what Hilaire Belloc was warning about. And their response was what? Ultranationalism. And many people responded to the Bolshevik terror by subscribing to Nazi ideology or some other ethnocentric ultranationalistic ideology. And they turned to mass murder. And they had recourse to mass murder. And they themselves became genocidal. And what do we see today? What we see today is many young people watching with horror what Israel did to Gaza and what Israel continues to do to Gaza and to the Palestinians. And many people, especially young people, are making the same mistake as what many young people did in the mid-20th century. And that is, they are treading upon the road of Hitlerism. And they are treading upon that path of revering and romanticizing the Nazis. And because so many young people are treading upon this path, we are going to return right back to the very evils of the past. And many of these people will say, well, we hate Israel because Israel is doing mass murder. But their response is to subscribe to Hitlerism and to romanticize Hitler and glorify Hitler, and to glorify the Nazis who were mass murderers. And if these people get their way, and if this Nazi seed, which is germinating right now, grows to the point where it becomes a massive tree and its roots entrench themselves into the souls of many people, they will become what they claim to be against. They will become the mass murderers that they claim to be against. They will become genocidal. They will become mass murderers. They will become advocates for slaughtering innocent people, just like the Nazis became exactly what they claimed to have been against. And this is the lesson of history. This is the lesson of history that we are ignoring. And it's like what the professor J. Rufus Fears said. He said that the biggest lesson of history is that we do not learn from history. And that is the warning that I give to you guys. Anyway, I've talked long enough. You guys have just heard some theology. God bless.